Welcome to Non-Toxic, a podcast about masculinity and the climate crisis. My name is Daniel Penny. I'm a journalist and critic who's been covering the intersection of culture and climate for outlets like the New York Times, the Financial Times, GQ, and the New Yorker.
And I'm Andrew S. Lewis, an environmental journalist who writes for the New York Times Magazine, Outside Magazine, Yale Environment 360, and others. For the past decade, I've traveled the world, writing about the impacts of climate change on small communities. I also wrote a book called The Drowning of Money Island, about a section of my New Jersey hometown that disappeared in the wake of Superstorm Sandy.
Like a lot of millennials, we grew up hearing Al Gore talk about global warming and the polar bears starving, and being told our generation was going to be the one to fix things. But now we're all grown up. Oil companies continue to make record profits, and the planet is still getting hotter.
Daniel and I had pretty different upbringings. I grew up hunting and fishing in the Pine Barrens of rural South Jersey.
And the only hunting I've ever done is for a specific brand of granola in the Park Slope Food Co-op. But we share concern for how completely fucked our planet is going to be if we don't change course. And because we both work in the media business, we also share frustration with how little attention climate change and the environment seem to get from men's media, which is weird because there are thousands of publications, content producers, podcasts, and TikTokers aimed at talking to women about climate and sustainability. Where are the dudes?
So we think this media silence reinforces the narrative that environmental issues aren't for men. It makes the problem worse by turning guys off from climate change or inviting grifters to take over the conversation and go unchallenged.
While it's essential that women take a leading role in combating this crisis, we don't think we can afford to write off half the population.
It wasn't always like this. Before the fossil fuel industry targeted in their public influence campaigns older, white men, climate change was not a political issue. It certainly wasn't a gendered one. The birth of the American environmental movement is associated with swashbuckling figures like Teddy Roosevelt. For all his faults, was definitely both an environmentalist and a man's man. But starting in the 1980s, fossil fuel juggernauts like Exxon, Peabody Coal, and BP spent hundreds of millions of dollars convincing guys that scientists were a bunch of nerds and climate change was a hoax. These were the days of cheap gas, talk radio, and truck nuts, and we're still living with the consequences.
They're all frauds. They are all liars. They are skunks. And they ought to be held up for public ridicule. Obama said he wants to restore science to its rightful whatever. Then he ought to be leading the way to find out who these people are, what they've done, who they've infected, who went along with them, calling them out by name, making sure that every scientist at every university in this country that's been involved in this is named and fired, drawn and quartered, or whatever it is. Because this is a worldwide hoax. And its primary target was you, the people of the United States of America.
Talk about setting up the next 10 years, right? Drawn and quartered.
So Rush Limbaugh's had a lot of influence, and people like him have had a lot of influence on how Americans and people across the world think about climate change. According to academic studies conducted in the US and Europe, men are less likely than women to believe climate change will affect their lives or pose a threat to their future. And in terms of their everyday habits, it's really clear. Men eat more meat, recycle less often, keep their thermostats higher than women do. We buy fewer sustainable products because we don't want to look feminine. Researchers call this the eco-gender gap. At the extreme end of the spectrum, some men define their masculinity against the environment. That infamous Twitter beef between activist Greta Thunberg and kickboxer turned online misogynist Andrew Tate began with Tate showing off his collection of gas-guzzling cars and bragging about their emissions. It ended with him arrested by Romanian police for suspected rape and human trafficking.
I'm obviously a stranger to online controversy. It's not something I often do. But now, the mainstream press is commenting on the fact that I was informing Greta that my very extensive car collection with internal combustion engines, which run on dead dinosaurs, have an enormous emission profile. And she replied by telling me her own email address. Greta's email address is, I have small dick energy.
And so his defense video ended up allegedly being a key piece of evidence that led to his own arrest.
Really got her there, Tate.
The differences between how men and women understand their relationship to the environment, I think we can all say, have huge consequences. Men are not only failing to stop climate breakdown, but are in many ways actively making it worse, because that's the manly thing to do. From forums on Reddit bashing soy boys to Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' macho climate denialism to the manifestos of mass shooters who increasingly identify as eco-fascists. We will be taking a hard look at how so-called toxic masculinity has brought us to a very dangerous precipice.
So that's the situation. Here are the stakes. The planet is currently on track to get warmer by 2.4 degrees Celsius and 2.6 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. That's about a degree warmer than the absolute limit world leaders pledged to avoid at the Paris Climate Accords way back in 2015. Blowing past 1.5 C means millions more people around the world will die from preventable floods, fires, storms, droughts, and famines. Hundreds of millions more will be displaced. And that's the stuff that awaits us in the future. But already, right now, hurricanes are stronger, wildfires are bigger, and biodiversity is being gutted. Not to mention the billions of dollars governments are paying out to pick up the pieces after each new unnatural disaster. And yet we're still pumping out record volumes of CO2 each year and still building more fossil fuel infrastructure. It's worth saying again, oil and gas companies made record profits in 2022. And don't take my word for it. Here's UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres.
Under current policies, the world is headed for 2.8 degrees of global heating by the end of the century. In other words, we are headed for a global catastrophe.
Okay, so despite how bad things are and how bad they're going to get, many men would literally rather die than change their climate cooking lifestyles, simply because those lifestyles are so tied up in the idea of what a man is supposed to be.
To change attitudes, we need a different approach, one that brings men into the conversation. On this podcast, we invite listeners to critically examine the relationship between masculinity and climate, to hear from experts from around the world and learn from the experiences of everyday guys like themselves. Some of the people we'll meet are doing incredible things to understand our environment and mitigate climate change. Others are undermining these efforts at every turn, and we're going to call them out. We don't claim to have all the answers, but we hope you'll join us as we try to figure out what it means to be non-toxic. Non-Toxic is a production of Loose Thread Studios, hosted by me, Daniel Penny.
And me, Andrew Lewis. Music is by Nathan Sharp. Art is by Sam Creasy. We're a listener-supported show, and we can't change the conversation around climate without your donations. So please go to patreon.com/nontoxicpodcast and become a patron today.
You can sign up to receive our members-only monthly newsletter, exclusive merch, and more. And please make sure to rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps people find the show. But nothing does that better than telling somebody you know about it. Help us spread the word.